Hi everyone, welcome to my little corner of vegan YouTube. My name is Alina. Today I'm excited to share with you my recipe for a delicious and beautiful sourdough bread loaf. I've been making this recipe for over a year now. It's pretty easy. It doesn't take a lot of time. I've seen a lot of sourdough bread videos online and it seems like they're way too involved time-wise. Like you have to do something every hour or half an hour for like many hours and you can't even leave the house. So it seems like regular people with regular lives can never make something like that. So you'll see that in my method, there's a little bit of hands-on time in the morning. Then in the afternoon, you do a little bit. And after that, later in the evening, you actually bake the bread and you have this beautiful, delicious loaf ready to go by dinner time. This method doesn't require any special fancy tools like banneton. We're going to skip it completely. Also, I don't use a fancy type of Dutch oven. The Dutch oven I use is the cast iron by Lodge. It's not enameled, so it's much cheaper than Le Creuset and those type of enameled ones, but it's really hardy and it will last you a long time.
First off, I'm going to make my dough. Here's what I'm going to use. I've got my unbleached bread flour. I've got some whole wheat flour. And also over here I have spelt flour. I like to use a combination of a few different types of flour because it adds more nutrients and also the flavor is more interesting. Then I have my iodized salt. You can also use sea salt if you'd like. And the most important part, my sourdough starter. I keep my starter in the fridge where it rises over the course of a few days. Once it starts deflating, I know that it's hungry, which is perfect for baking bread. Here I have some measuring cups and a couple spoons. And these two bowls right here. The white one is the biggest bowl I own. This is where I'm going to make the dough and keep it as it rises. And of course I have my digital scale. This is a very simple, inexpensive one. I'm going to link it up in the video description. So let's go ahead and put our bowl on the scale. Always remember to press tare to zero out the weight of the bowl itself. Next up, I'm going to add my flour. I'm going to need 520 grams of it. I'm going to start with my unbleached bread flour. Then I'm going to add my whole wheat and my spelt flour. I'm not measuring the exact amounts of those. I'm just adding about a handful of each. I also like using rye flour instead of spelt, so if you can't find spelt flour at your local grocery store, then rye flour also works very well. Okay, I'm up to 403 grams, so I'm going to fill up the rest with my bread flour until it reaches 520 grams. Oops, that's a bit too much, so I'm going to take some out. And now it's just right. Next up, I'm going to add my salt, about 2 teaspoons. I don't really measure it out with a spoon or anything like that, but if you feel more comfortable measuring it the proper way, then sure, please do. Now I'm going to mix everything together as evenly as I can. I find that using a whisk for this works the best because it really makes sure everything is distributed nice and even. Be careful when whisking up dry flour because it's really easy to get it to start flying out of the bowl. Not a big deal, of course, but it's just more mess to clean up later.
Next, we're going to introduce the sourdough starter. I will be making a video pretty soon about how I feed my sourdough starter. When it's ready, I'm going to link it up at the end of this video and down below in the video description. So check it out after you watch this video.
So here's my sourdough starter in all its glory. I know that it's ready to go when it gets this runny. This means that the yeast has eaten through all that starch in the flour that I fed it last time, which is just what we're looking for when we are ready to make our bread dough. Here's my measuring cup. I'm going to press tare to zero out its weight. Now I need to measure out about 95 grams of my sourdough starter. Okay, I got 96. Close enough. Next, I need to measure out the amount of water that I'll be adding to my dough. I told you that I'm using 520 grams of flour, so naturally the question is, how much water do I need to use here?
So here's the deal. The amount of water that I'll be adding depends on what kind of flour I'm using. If I'm using 100% bread flour, then I'm going to use a little bit of less water, like 385 grams or so. But when I'm adding whole wheat flour into the mixture, along with maybe some other types like spelt flour in this case, then I'm going to up that amount to 400 grams. Because whole wheat flour is kind of thirstier, so it's going to want a little bit more moisture, whereas white bread flour is not going to be as thirsty, so you want to start with a little bit less.
So here we go. I got my cold filtered water. I'm going to measure 400 grams of it, or 401, that's close enough. The next step is to mix the water into the sourdough starter. I'm going to pour some water right into this measuring cup with the starter and whisk it all together with a fork. After that, I'm going to pour this mixture into the rest of the water and give it a nice whisk just so everything is nice and mixed together. Finally, I'm going to pour this into my flour and start mixing the dough. Now, I know that a lot of sourdough recipes call for a process called autolyze, which means that you first mix the flour and the water without the starter, let it sit for a while, maybe an hour or so, and only after that you fold in the starter. But from my experience, it's really not necessary. When you mix the water and the starter and then add them both to the flour at the same time, it really saves you a lot of time and effort, and the resulting bread is just as good and delicious. Now, note what I'm going to do next. I'm going to take the same bowl where I mixed my water and starter. I'm going to rinse it off and fill up with some cool water.
The reason I need this water in the bowl is because I'm going to wet my hands before I go start messing with the dough. Otherwise, the dough will start sticking to my hands and it'll be a total mess. But when my hands are wet, thankfully, the dough doesn't stick to them so much.
Before I get my hands in, I'm going to use a spoon to mix everything together. The goal here is to get all of the water absorbed by the flour, but as you see, the mixture still looks pretty crumbly. This is where I'm going to get my hands in. There's another benefit to using wet hands here. If the dough looks a little bit dry, that water on your hands will get it a little bit more moist. This way you can incorporate all the little dry bits of flour that you may still feel on the surface. But also this lets you control how much moisture you're adding, because if the dough is already pretty moist, you can just shake off the excess water off of your hands. Note that I'm not really kneading the dough here, I'm just mixing it together until everything is incorporated and there are no dry spots left. It's going to look a little shaggy, a little rough, a little sticky, but that's exactly what I'm looking for. Now it's time to let the dough rest. I'm going to cover my bowl with a wet kitchen towel and set my kitchen timer for 15 minutes.
By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, please give it a like. I will really appreciate it. And also subscribe to my channel so we stay in touch and you never miss another video.
So it's been 15 minutes. Let's take a look at our dough. You can see that it looks much more relaxed. So here's for comparison. The picture on the left is what it looked like earlier when we first put it together. You can see that it's more rough. And on the right, this is what it looks like right now. You can see that some of those rough spots have softened out quite a bit. Next, I'm going to do my first set of stretch and folds. If you've seen other sourdough bread baking videos, I'm sure you've seen this before. Basically, you take one side of the dough, stretch it out a little bit, and fold it onto itself. However, I like to take this process even further. I haven't seen a lot of people do this, but basically when I do my stretches, I take the dough out of the bowl and kind of let it hang in the air, stretching it out this way. This really helps develop nice and strong gluten strains.
You may be wondering, why do we need to create those strong gluten strains? The reason is because those gluten strains will help trap the air bubbles that appear when the yeast start eating up all that starch. They burp out those carbon dioxide bubbles and the bread starts rising as a result. If the gluten strains aren't very weak, then the bread won't rise as much.
This is also why we use bread flour when baking bread instead of all-purpose flour, because bread flour has a higher gluten content, and as a result, those gluten strains that we develop during stretch and folds will be much stronger. I actually once used all-purpose flour by mistake when making sourdough, and during stretch and folds, that dough kept tearing, all because there wasn't enough gluten. So this is what my dough looks like after the first set of stretch and folds. You can see that it's much more smooth looking. I'm going to cover it with a towel again and let it rest for another 15 minutes. All right, now it's time to check on the dough again. Let's see what it looks like. Okay, so you can see that it's way more smooth at this point. I've got my last set of stretch and folds to do. I only do 2 sets of stretch and folds. I know that a lot of sourdough bread recipes suggest that you do as many as 4 or 5 or even 6 sets, but I find that doing that takes way too much time and effort. People with regular, busy lives don't usually have all day for all kinds of manipulations with their bread dough. Anyway, let's take a look at my dough over here. You can see that it's nice and smooth and stretchy and just so lovely. There are no rough bits left at all, so I think I'm almost done over here with my stretch and folds. Next, it's time to set up the dough for proofing. I'm going to flip it upside down and shape it into this nice smooth ball. I'm going to put it back in the bowl and cover it with the same wet kitchen towel. Now I need to proof the dough for a few hours in a nice and slightly warm environment in my kitchen.
A few words on how you can create a nice warm environment for your sourdough to proof. First, if it's summertime or if you keep your house warm, then you don't need to bother. You just set your bowl with a wet towel on top somewhere nice and warm in your house for a few hours. Actually, it's not going to take too long. It takes me about 5-6 hours in the summer to get my dough rise to the proper levels. The second thing you can do is to keep your dough in the oven. That works for winter time or if your house is naturally cool. So if you have the bread proofing option on your stove, then it's great. If not, you can just turn on the light in the oven without any heat and keep your dough in there, covered with a wet towel, of course. Or like in my case, I don't have the proofing option. My oven light is actually out. So what I do, I turn my oven to 200 degrees for just 1 or 2 minutes. So it will never actually reach 200 degrees. It'll just get a little bit warm. And so I put my bowl with the bread in there, as you see. Lastly, the third option is to take a nice and fluffy bath towel and cover your bowl with it. The bowl first, of course, cover with a wet towel. So you can use any of these methods, whatever works for you, honestly.
But wait, before I told you any of this, I should have told you about how long it's going to take for the dough to proof. The truth is, depending on how warm your house is, it's going to take anywhere between 4 and 5 hours if your house is warm, all the way to 10 and 12 hours if your house is on the cooler side. When the dough is ready, it will expand quite a bit and get nice and puffy, but not necessarily double in size like yeasted bread dough tends to do. If you shake the bowl a little bit, you'll see that the dough gets nice and wiggly in the middle. Ideally, you shouldn't see a lot of bubbles on the surface, because if you do, that means that the dough is beginning to get overproofed. Even though I've baked this bread dozens of times, I still mess up sometimes. For example, I recently kept my dough proofing for way too long, and as a result it got super bubbly on the surface. If this happens to you, it doesn't mean that you have to throw your dough away. You can still bake it, but you'll notice that the loaf won't rise very well, and the texture of your bread will come out a little bit gummy. So here we are, it's been about 7 hours, and now my dough is ready to be shaped into a loaf. Here are the tools that I'm going to use. I've got my parchment paper that I got at Costco. I got this nice big glass bowl. I got my all-purpose flour for flouring the surface. And I also have these dough scrapers. I bought them in a set from Amazon. I really love them. You'll see how well they work. I'll link them up in the description. Next, I'm going to get a piece of parchment paper to line my bowl. This bowl with the parchment is what I'm going to use instead of the banneton. I'm going to put my dough in here after I shape it, and I'm going to let it rise in here. And then when it's ready to bake, I'm going to put it in my Dutch oven right on the parchment. It's important to use a good quality parchment paper here, because if you use a cheaper brand, then it's very likely that the dough will get stuck to it during baking. And then once your bread is done, the parchment paper will be stuck to it, and that sure won't be pretty. Next, I'm going to flour my work surface. This is where I'm going to be shaping my loaf. To get the dough out of the bowl, I'm going to use this silicone bowl scraper. I'm going to flour it a little bit and start scraping the sides of the bowl, kind of getting under the dough a little bit. Now I'm going to shake my bowl over my floured surface, and eventually, as you see, the dough will come right out. Now it's time to shape the loaf. First, I'm going to fold the dough onto itself from 4 directions, and then I'm going to lift it up and put it back on the surface upside down. Next comes the part that may seem tricky, but once you try it a few times, you'll really get a hand of it. Basically, I'm using my dough scraper to reach under the dough and then turn it around, kind of tucking in the sides. I have to make sure that my hands are floured, because otherwise the dough will start sticking to them really easily. The whole point of this is to create a surface tension on the surface of my dough ball. This surface tension will help the dough keep its shape better during baking. As a result, my loaf will start spreading up as it bakes instead of spreading out. You know you're done when your dough ball looks nice and plump and has a smooth, slightly shiny surface. Once I get to that point, I'm going to scoop up my dough ball and put it right into my parchment-lined bowl. I'm going to sprinkle it generously with some flour and put it in the fridge to rest for at least an hour. While my dough is resting, let me introduce you to my Dutch oven. This is a cast iron Lodge Dutch oven, the largest size they make. It's really well made, really sturdy, something that your great grandma would have used some 80 years ago. As you see, it's not enameled like those fancy Le Creuset Dutch ovens, but also this means that it is much cheaper and you never have to worry about the enamel chipping or scratching or anything like that. Next step is to start preheating the oven. I'm going to put in my empty Dutch oven and start preheating to 450 degrees.
As soon as it's preheated, I'm going to put my dough in and start baking. Some bakers suggest that you preheat your oven even longer to get it like really hot. But I find it's unnecessary. If my Dutch oven gets too hot, then I notice that the bottom of the bread can start getting burnt. So I'm gonna get it just hot enough, and as soon as it's up to 450, I'm putting it in. I'm not waiting any longer.
While my oven is preheating, let me show you my bread loom. This is a tool that bakers use to score the surface of the dough just before baking. You've probably seen these in other bread videos before. I like this one because it's really easy to use, plus it comes with 15 replacement blades. However, if you're vegan, please note that it's not completely vegan because it comes with this little leather pouch that you store the blade part in. So if this is a deal breaker for you, you can just get a different one. Now that my oven is almost preheated, I'm going to go ahead and score my bread. The way I do it isn't very conventional. Usually people either do one big cut or they go all out with all kinds of fancy designs. I usually make 3 or 4 cuts like this. My daughter calls it tiger bread because when it's baked, it will have these pretty stripes on the surface. Next, I'm going to get my Dutch oven out, take the lid off, and put my dough in right by the parchment paper. I'm going to tuck in these loose ends. You can also cut them off with scissors if you'd like. Put the lid back on and back in the oven it goes. I'm going to break up the baking process into 2 parts. For this first part, I'm going to set the timer for 23 minutes. Once the time is up, I'm going to take my Dutch oven out. You'll see that my loaf is as big as it's gonna get. It's not gonna rise anymore after this. But as you see, it's quite pale, so I'm going to put it back in the oven for 16 minutes so it finishes baking and develops a nice, lovely golden crust. About 8 minutes later, I'm going to slide the parchment paper from under the loaf. Then I'm going to rotate the loaf 180 degrees so that both sides get baked evenly, and then we're going to leave it in for another 8 minutes. Finally, another 8 minutes later, my bread is done. So I'm going to take it out of the oven. And here we go. I present to you my sourdough tiger bread in all of its glory. I usually wait at least half an hour before I start cutting my bread. This will allow my loaf to cool off. Plus, the insides need a little bit of extra time to set properly. Otherwise, they might turn out a little too sticky.
So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you now have a better understanding how to make sourdough bread easily without like tons of fancy equipment and whatnot. I've linked up all the important links down below for all the tools I use and recommend. Please give this video a like. I will really appreciate it. Subscribe to my channel so we stay in touch and you never miss another video. Next up, check out this video over here. I'm going to put my video for how I feed my sourdough starter over here as soon as that video is done. Until then, I'm going to put another baking video. Please check it out and I will see you very soon right there in that video.